Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird. Welcome back to Wicca 101. This week's lesson is about the Wheel of the Year, so let's jump right in. Every religion has its own special holidays. Wicca is no exception. We call our holidays Sabbats, and these are holy days that are drawn from ancient celebrations and traditions, primarily of the ancient Celts and the Teutonic peoples, but you will also see some Greco-Roman as well as some slight Mediterranean influences in the mythological motifs, and that's because that whole area, there was a lot of cultural cross-pollination, and of course, cultural cross-pollination also involves spiritual and religious cross-pollination, so you'll see those influences. And depending on if you work with a specific pantheon, you will find that certain personages from that pantheon have they have more correlations with the general flow of the Wheel of the Year than others. And so this is an opportunity to really tailor these celebrations to be in tune with your own spiritual interests and where you really are. And of course, no matter where you're from or where your ancestors were from or what part of the world your particular gods hail from, there's always an agricultural cycle. And this cycle follows the waxing and waning power of the sun, its effect upon the earth and the planting and the harvesting of the crops, that kind of cycle, the cycle of when there's light and when there's dark. And because it's all tied up with the sun, and the sun is the chief symbol of the god, that is why this mythology emphasizes so much his yearly march through that wheel, where his journey takes him, what we can learn from it, how this has spiritual implications for our own lives. And it's an interesting thing to keep going through, because every year you go through it, you notice a little bit more layers, a little bit more depth. There's a lot to take in. Now today we're doing a very brief overview. This is not super in-depth, but I want to give you an idea of how the whole wheel just flows together and why it keeps on going. Obviously, if you are in the southern hemisphere and watching this, everything is going to be reversed because your seasons are reversed. But you'll still get the gist. Now, as we go through the Wheel of the Year, month by month, I've been creating playlists of videos dealing with these specific sabbats, and these go into greater depth. And as time goes on, of course, those playlists will get longer. There'll be more details, more involved. So, so far, I have a playlist for Mabon, and I've started on the Samhain ones. And then as we go forward, I'll be incorporating all the other holidays. So depending on when you watch this class, there could be quite a bit there. So look on the channel, on the YouTube version of this channel, and just see what playlists are available, and you'll be able to pick your field of interest. There's lots to explore there. Now, our Wheel of the Year, it begins with Yule. Yule is the winter solstice. And solstice is essentially a word that means sun standing still. Now, the winter solstice is the weakest point of the sun. This is when it has the least amount of power, when it shines for the least amount of time during the day. And because of this, this is seen as the birth and, honestly, the rebirth of the sun. This is also the period of time when the Oak King, who rules over the light half of the year, comes back into the picture, comes back into his power, and the goddess is seen more so as either this brand new mother, or also as the crone of winter. Now, it's as just a brief reminder, the god and the goddess, they can take whatever form is appropriate at any time. They are made up of all things, they can appear as all things, and so our tendency to view them in a particular light during different points of the year, that's an effort for us to understand what they're doing and why they're doing it. It's a method for us to understand. It doesn't represent the only thing that they are capable of being at that moment. Now, the winter solstice, which of course occurs, in December, kind of usually around the 21st or so. It depends a little bit. The date will vary. But it is a time of celebration. It's a time of hopes. And when you're planning for the next year, even though our spiritual new year is at Samhain, the calendar new year is in January, so the further you get into December, the further you are thinking about, okay, what do I want to plan for this coming year? And there's a lot of hope with that. There's a lot of resolutions, some of which we keep, some of which we don't. But it's all part of this nice sense of renewal. And not just renewal, but I have time to figure out how to put this renewed energy into practice in some form. So that's the basic gist of Yule. Moving on to Amalk, which takes place February 2nd. This is more of the stage of childhood. This is when the god and the goddess, they are both pictured in forms of being young children with all the innocence and the joy and the delight and the sense of play that goes along with that. This is a time of purification. It's the first whisper of spring, depending on where you live. Some areas they do have very hardy flowers that actually bloom through the snows. So if you're lucky enough to live in a place like that, well, come to Blackbird's Brew and share some pictures of it when that comes around, because that would be pretty to see. Amalk is also the first hinting of the return of the light. Since the solstice, there's been a gradual uptick in the number of daylight hours, but by the time we get to Amalk, I think we're starting to notice it a little bit more. Now, the meaning of the word Amalk generally is translated as having to do with the idea of being in milk. This is a time of lambing in which the sheep, they're having all their babies, so of course they have all this milk. It's that end of hibernation, it's that end of that waiting period. Things are starting to come back to life, even if only in a small way, but we are seeing signs in that direction. Next we have Ostara, which is the vernal equinox. Equinox means that there are equal hours of daylight and nighttime hours. It is a time of adolescence, and it's also a time of balance. At Ostara, it's like having that first flush of youth, the return to fertility, fresh life. You're energized. You have all the craziness that you might remember from your teenage years. It's that kind of chaotic energy. For me, I view Ostara as the beginning of the light half of the year, because from this point forward, we have more daylight hours than we do nighttime hours. You can make a case to divide, which half of the year is, the light versus the dark, really for any of these holidays that are directly opposed to each other. But for me, I tend to think of the equinoxes as really that major turning point. Ostara is also a time to get back to work. There's things to be doing in the gardening. It's time for spring cleaning. It's time to decide what it is, not just decide what it is we want to do this coming year, but start, doing that work, putting things into action, putting things into practice. And then, pardon me, allergies are just horrible right now. And next we move on to Beltane, which takes place on May 1st. It is all about the marriage, the hand fasting of the god and the goddess. Hand fasting is essentially a pagan marriage ceremony, pagan weddings. They can be legal depending on if the clergy that you're using is registered with the state and fulfills the legal requirements. Some people do that, some people do not. But when people are talking about hand fasting, we're talking about the commitment of marriage, whether that marriage is legally recognized or not. So this is essentially the marriage of the god and the goddess. It's a time of merriment and fertility and romance, creativity, youth, and it's also a time of a lot of activity for the Fae. There are some beliefs thinking that the Fae, whenever the veil is thin, and the veil's at its thinnest during Beltane and Samhain, the Fae are just very active, and they're around, and they're up, and they're doing things, and of course, their energy is part of what's helping bring the whole world back to life and into its full flower. After Beltane, we have Litha, which occurs at the summer solstice. So this is the prime of life. This is the very height of the sun's power. And at this time in the mythology, we have a symbolic struggle between the Oak King and the Holly King. The Oak King loses the fight. The Holly King gains ascendancy. He's triumphant, and the Oak King recedes into the background until he is reborn at Yule, and then, of course, it's his time to take over again. At this point of the year, the goddess and the land itself is just pregnant with new life. We're starting to see some of the results of that initial flush of fertility, and everything's just kind of buzzing along, starting to come together. Next, we have Lunasa, August 1st, and this symbolizes the idea of middle age. You're not in the full prime of your life, but you also haven't descended into old age. You don't have the same weaknesses that come along with old age. So this is kind of, I really see this time of year as the god being at his most kingly. The goddess is at her most queenly. They're just not only on their thrones, but they are secure on their thrones. They're fully committed, and they're giving over all of their energies to make the first of the harvest happen. So it's the celebration of the first fruits. It's also about the beginnings of preparation for the coming winter, and also for the gradual return of the dark. Just as in Molk, when we start seeing a little bit more light, come Lunasa, we start seeing a little more dark. Lunasa is a time of a great deal of commitment and hard work and starting to reap the rewards. Not fully, but beginning to. And it's also about wrapping up everything that you've toiled at during the course of the year, at least as far as the garden is concerned, or as far as agriculture is concerned. Things are starting to wane down. Then we have Mabon, which is the autumnal equinox, and this is a time of old age and death, specifically the death of the god, and the goddess is widowed, and so you have overtones of mourning and grief and separation. This is the second harvest, also the main harvest. This is when you really finish gathering things in. Things are getting stored up for the winter. You're starting to know if you're going to be in good shape for the months to come. This is, for me, the beginning of the dark half of the year, because we now have more dark than we do have light during the day. And it's a wonderful time for reflection. What have you achieved so far? What do you want to achieve before Samhain and before the beginning of the next cycle? Did you get as far into your goals as what you had hoped you did? Where did you fail? Well, how can you pursue that goal differently and hopefully more successfully in the future? There's a lot to think over. And then that brings us to Samhain. October 31st, unironically taking place at the same time as Halloween, and of course a lot of the customs and traditions have all been wrapped up in together. So you'll see a lot of pagans fully participating in both the spiritual aspects of Samhain and the cultural fun of Halloween. And this is a point where we are in between the cycles. This is the third harvest, which is the blood harvest of the livestock, making sure that you have enough supplies to support what you can through the winter, and that everything else has been taken and prepared so that it will last you. From a Celtic point of view, this is the beginning of winter itself. And at this point at the time, the god is now the Lord of the Dead. He's in the other world, and the goddess has just joined him. This is a time for honoring your ancestors of both your physical and your spiritual lineage. And this gets done a variety of ways. And as we go forward in the month of October, there'll be plenty of videos talking about that. The Samhain is also time for the wild hunt and the spiritual new year. Now, during the wild hunt, the souls of those who have died have gathered up, and they're being brought into the other world. They're meeting the god and the goddess. They are being prepared for that particular transition and for whatever happens next to them after that point. I don't know the rules on reincarnation exactly. I don't know if how many people are immediately reincarnated or how much of a rest there might be in between lifetimes. But it is for people who are in this state of in-between. You are discorporated. You're no longer interacting with the physical world in that same way. And for the spiritual new year, we have finally concluded this life cycle, as illustrated by the god, and as we can see visually in the land surrounding us. Everything has come full circle, and that's really what Samhain's about. It's about coming full circle and then getting ready for the next cycle. So this yearly journey through every season and every life stage, it honors the god, and this is also an opportunity for us to deepen our spirituality. As you can see through the cycle of all this, you reap what you sow. It's very literal and spiritual. And honestly, how much we get out of the Sabbats and how much we get out of Wicca, how much we get out of paganism, it is 100% determined by what we put into it. So if you happen to hear people talking about, oh, this doesn't have very much depth, or I don't really find any purpose or meaning in it, my response to that would be, well, how deeply did you look exactly? This isn't just about gathering knowledge. It's also about applying it, understanding what it means, and going beneath the surface and starting to connect some dots and seeing how things connect together, and how this cycle of the Wheel of the Year it isn't just an excuse for a party or an excuse to make special foods or decorate the house a certain way. It has meaning for us. It represents something that we go through on a yearly basis, and it also represents where we are within our own personal life cycle and the spiritual implications of that, and how we should be continuing on into our maturity and cooperating and growing with this process in the manner in which we should. Now, your homework for this week, should you choose to accept it. First, you are asked to describe the main themes of Yule, Imalk, Astara, Beltane, Litha, Lunasa, Mabon, and Samhain. Then you have 2 questions, which is which Sabbat is the most interesting to you and why. And if you want to do outside research, absolutely 100% encourage that. If you find yourself particularly taken by an idea, pursue it. And then the last question is, what do you think about the Wheel of the Year mirroring your own life cycle? So that could be an interesting discussion and see where your thoughts take you. If you decide to participate in the homework and you're wanting to get a little bit of feedback, post your answers to these questions in the study hall channel on Blackbird's Brew on Discord. There will be a link in the description box below for you to join that forum if you haven't already. I think this is really it for this week, so by all means please subscribe, like this video, leave a comment if you would like to, and I will see you next week. Bye for now.